Hey Max,
Hey, how's it going?
not bad, not bad. Yourself?
I'm good. It's good to see you.
Yeah, I had to come back and see. I forget the gentleman's name, but um, the the policy creation that he has for that PR. Yeah,
Yeah, the AI thing.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, that'll be pretty wild. It's on the minute, so it should happen. Then after that, I see some naming bike shedding, and then sorry, I haven't thought about the pub sub config thing, JDIP. Is that out there, or it like completely missed my radar?
I pinged it on Slack, I think, a couple of days ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've been kind of distracted this week, sadly.
Yeah, it's all right. You can, if you can take a look this week or before next week, and then we can discuss that.
Oh, for
Because
sure.
I don't
Well,
think Shirtes or Rita also had time to look at it. I didn't see anybody's comment there. So,
yeah, but this is in service of you were eliminating that flag, and you said there's going to be a config object that replaced that flag, and that's this
uh,
basically.
so that is different. So this is a follow-up to that. We are replacing config map to a specific CRD. um, and that flag is just hurdle in sense that you need to specify the name of the config map you are going to use, and that's in my opinion it's an added step to user experience that we can eliminate by just creating the config map with appropriate settings, and that config map can automatically be reconciled and added to pub subsystem.
Config
uh,
map or custom resource?
So right now we are using config map, right? And the PR that I have right now will keep using the config map. This is a design document that replaces that existing config map to a CRD.
Oh, this is a design doc. Okay, sorry. And the design doc replaces the config map to a CRD, and the PR makes the config map like uniquely identifiable, basically, or something.
Uh,
I
Okay, let me just step back and explain a
Okay.
little further. Okay, right. So the PR. So right now, what we are doing is we need to specify connection's name and the topic we want to send the messages to, in flag in the gatekeeper pod itself. What PR does is eliminates that two flags, so that now any config map that you create with appropriate settings for the pub sub backend gets automatically reconciled, and any, like, if you have multiple config maps also, you can basically uh, send those messages using those existing config map in your system without specifying the name of the specific config map.
I think I get you. The config map holds all of the config necessary for knowing which events go where, and also for establishing the connection. Is that accurate? Okay.
But
And good.
so now, we like, current implementation is that you need to do an additional step to mention that name of the specific config map into gatekeeper's pod, so that gatekeeper knows which config map to use for messaging, right? We
Mhm.
are eliminating that, and we are just relying on users to create appropriate config maps, and any appropriate config maps will send the messages for those backends.
What makes a config map appropriate?
Like, it has all the variables needed to establish a connection.
So we're trying to intuit it based off the contents of the config map. Could I maliciously use that by creating a config map to snoop on everyone's requests?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that
mean,
that would be my concern with that.
but then if So what you are suggesting is that somebody can have access to config map but cannot have access to updating gatekeeper pod, because if you have access to update the gatekeeper pod, you can do that anyways.
Yeah, you have to deploy the config map to the gatekeeper system namespace.
Oh yeah, if it's restricted to the namespace, there's some handle. Like
yeah.
Suspicious, like we're kind of creating extra work for ourselves if we're going to move to CRD anyway. But if the PR is already out there, then the work is already done. So whatever. Personally, I would have like just eaten all my lumps at once, right? And probably had less overall effort.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, since PR is already out, I think we can do this for a short term, like a user experience improvement. Since, I mean, you have to deploy to a gatekeeper system anyway, and then if you had access, you could look at the logs or like get it by other means too.
Yeah. If they need to be in gatekeeper system, that's a different kettle of fish. Then it's like any config map anywhere is eligible for. Yeah.
That is correct, right, Jay?
Yeah, we are looking for the config maps in the gatekeeper system.
Yeah.
Still, let me confirm on that. I don't want to miss anything.
But yeah, I agree with Max's concern if it's any like arbitrary config map.
Anyway, I hear there's an AI.
Oh, should I do the demo? I have it now. Hold on. Let me share my screen. Yay. I mean, this is the demo I made for. I always miss how to share screen. It's this green button, and I just overlook it. How do I share screen? Oh, there it is. No, I want to. Hold on. Let's just do the terminal. Right. Can you all see my terminal?
I can.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay. Right.
Hello.
I am gonna do the demo. Okay. So this is the same as the pre-recorded demo, but I'm doing it live, so anything can go wrong. So hold on to your seats. Yeah. So in this case, we have the gatekeeper controller manager binary with the container with the that's built on the LLM branch that I have for the gatekeeper, and obviously it's using the LLM branch on the frameworks. So, so we're just looking at a privileged constraint template for blocking the privileged containers. But if you can see here, right here, we have the engine LLM in here as opposed to Rego or Cell today. And then in terms of the source, we only have the prompt. And this is just basically regular English. And you can also, I'm guessing you can do it multilingual, as long as the LLM expects that input and can output the decision correctly. So we are going to add our template in here, and we have a constraint. So in this case, we have excluding kube system namespace, which is not important for this demo, and then we have we're excluding the Python image, also not important for this demo, but just for example purposes, if you want to try it out. So we are going to deploy our constraint. And then I am using kubectl AI for a full immersed AI experience here. This is also a self-promo for my kubectl AI tool. So we are going to create a pod that is privileged. And it also makes it easier to show how the generation works. And you can see the full YAML.
Oh, this is like an AI extension to kubectl. So
yeah,
it'll okay.
That'll generate. Okay, there's and yeah, it's basically created a pod spec with security context privilege true. And in this case, you can either do reprompt or apply or don't apply. In this case, we're going to apply, and then this should be blocked by our policy for not privileged containers because we don't want privileged containers. And as you can see, it got denied, and then this decision has been made by the LLM by itself. There was no conversion to Rego nor Cell. And then AI also made this explanation on why it was denied. And then for the next one, we're going to create a pod that is not privileged. So in this case, we're again using kubectl.ai.
This is very high confidence that AI is going to make the right decision here in this presentation.
Yeah, this is all live. OpenAI, I've seen it like I've never seen it miss. Other open weights LLMs have missed stuff. I tried with Mistral. Some of them were able to output the JSON we expect is we expected decision as a JSON, and it was able to output the JSON correctly, but some of the JSON was wrong in terms of like the older Mistral model. I haven't tried the newer one. There's a new one too.
Mixtral or Mistral?
The company is called Mistral. The model was called Mixtral with an X. And then there's two Mixtral models. There's one older one, which is like 7X8B, I think, or other way around, 8 times 7B. And then there's like a 8 times 22B or something like that just got released this week or so.
Yeah, and it's like over 100 gigabytes.
Yeah, that one you need to be GPU rich to be able to deploy. That is a technical term now. Okay, so and I have another example for allowed repos. So we are only allowing images from registries from the parameters list. So this is a similar one to the last one, but in terms of we're actually looking at the parameters list now. So the prompt doesn't actually have anything like specific. We have to look into the parameters. So in this case, we do not want Docker Hub images, but anything else should be fair game. So we deploy both our template and constraint. And we're gonna do a Nginx image. And it's gonna process in a second. All right. And yeah, there we have a simple pod spec. And let's apply. And it should be declined now. This is taking longer. Okay, cool. Yeah, it because it is declined because it is privileged and it is from restricted registry, which is docker.io. So we're going to see a pod with a non-Docker one now. So this should be allowed, I think. This one is it's a little bit interesting because sometimes it may not decline because of it may think it's a privilege or non-privilege. I haven't looked deeply into that one yet. So let's see if this works. We might need to tune the prompt a little bit if it's yeah. So this got declined because it thought privileged containers. Yeah, it thought it was privileged. I don't know if it is supposed to decline or not. I haven't looked deeply into the privileged thing. But yeah, we might need to if we want this to be approved, we might need to tweak the prompt a little bit to specify like, hey, if you must say security context privileged false or true, whatever.
You need to declare false, otherwise it's assumed privileged.
So it sounds like it did the correct thing, but I would have expected like any other way really. But yeah, I think that might need some tweaking for the prompt. Yeah, and then go ahead, Max.
Sorry, I no. What I'm saying is like if you look at the source code for the constraint template, like the hard-coded version of this,
yeah,
it would do the same thing.
Yeah, so I think it did the correct thing in the end, but it might have done it unintentionally or not. So I don't know the reason for that one. So and then this also works with Gator because it's using the same engine underneath. So in this case, we are generating a pod that is privileged and uses an Nginx, and I am piping the raw YAML output into Gator tests binary with the experimental enable LLM engine to enable the LLM engine, and then using the same policies for both, which is in the demo folder. And then both of them got denied because the resulting pod was privileged and was using Docker Hub.
So
and that is
if
it
you
for
don't
the
mind, I
demo.
ask,
Yeah, of course.
this is pretty awesome. Because I was expecting that maybe like if you describe or output the constraint template, there's still there's no Rego happening behind the scenes. Then it's
No,
the
this is
prompt
basically LLM deciding based on the prompts
based off the prompt.
in the admission request in the parameters list. So 3 things go into that one.
Okay, okay, I got you.
Did you want to show the, I don't know what to call it, system prompt, I guess, that augments the constraint template?
Oh yeah, I can do that. Just give me a second. I will need to change my screen.
And which system are you like? Which AI system are you hitting in the background? Like where?
This is using OpenAI GPT-4. There's 2 of them that support JSON. One of them, I think the older one, underneath. And then I think the kubectl AI is using a different one, so I don't get throttled because like the one I use gets throttled a lot. But yeah, for gatekeeper purposes, it's using a one of the 2 that can output JSON. But you can also use it with a open source LLM. But in that case, the decisions may or may not be accurate as OpenAI. Like I said, I found OpenAI to be like pretty good at this.
And
I
I'm
wonder.
very oh sorry.
No, go ahead. I had a separate
No,
thought.
I'm pretty new with AI and this domain, but like I know this experimental, obviously, but is the risk here? I see that if today it's producing the right decision or output, uh, if the system is tampered or trained differently, then we can potentially have a different outcome tomorrow when somebody tries to apply a resource because we've now trained the system to detect a certain type of malicious or a resource and we want it to do something that is malicious. Like, there's risks in that because there's no way to like we're locking down this policy rule or set of rules to only be this. It's like whatever AI evolves to is the risk, from my understanding.
Yeah, so some of the models will be like pinned in sort of things. So like you basically pin it to a specific, I mean, you can make it auto upgrade too, but you basically pin it to a specific version of the model. So in terms of like the model, it doesn't really change under your feet too much. But if you don't pin it and then you like have it like change under you, then yeah, that might happen because I don't know, maybe the endpoint you're hitting or like or the model you're hitting might have to be updated or changed somehow. Yeah, but if you're in control and then you can pin it, then it would not change under you.
Yeah, I mean, you also like don't know what the model knows. Like I'm kind of anthropomorphizing a little bit, but is it rejecting it because it actually knows, hey, this is what a privileged container consists of? Or does it just have like some other kind of pattern that this just happens to match? And that's why it's like making the correct decision, which, it seems like Sritesh was saying OpenAI was reliable here, but Mistral or Mixtral, I guess. Sritesh, you were saying it wasn't wrong all the time, but it was wrong a portion of the time. Is that right, or was it predictably wrong?
It wasn't. It was different, sort of indifferent. I didn't try to like optimize the prompts too much, but like as is, like when OpenAI was succeeding too much, Mistral was failing in those cases. It might be because OpenAI trained on more like Kubernetes YAMLs or whatever, right? So and then that might be a thing. We can also like augment it more with like giving some of the information needed to understand, like, hey, what's a privileged pod, right? So one of the things that kubectl AI does today, so we talked about the pin versions, right? So like that's basically like you can think of it also as like a knowledge cutoff, right? Say you ask like, I don't know, some like a changing article, say like about elections or something like that, right? Obviously the LLM has not been trained, so it does not know anything about any recent news. So what it can do is though, you can give it this information as part of the context, and then it can understand and basically take that information into account while making that decision. So, and I'll give you an example for this one. So for kubectl AI, the one you saw was the pre-built knowledge. So that's the using the model as is. But kubectl also has a mode to be able to use the Kubernetes API to be able to generate things. So that there's like a --K8s use case AI flag. So it will basically do the open API, or like you might know it also as Swagger, to get the API, like how an API might work, and then basically make a decision based on that. So say if you ask a model what create a validating policy admission or something, right? It may not know this because it is like a relatively new thing. But if you use it with the open API spec generation, then it's going to feed that information to it. Say, hey, this is the validating admission policy. Looks like that's the API spec. And then it's going to understand more to be able to create like a more accurate sort of thing.
Yeah.
Did that answer some of the questions about like the sort
Yeah,
of the
yeah, but back to the pinning, and again, this might be just because I'm, naive in the space of AI, but like if we talk about like the user experience or the user use case of how they maintain, I don't know how people maintain models. You're talking about pinning a model, at least, in my firm, I believe we're using a shared model, right? Or we may not be, I'm not sure. But in the cases where you are using shared models, can you pin a model but that might impact another team that needs the more recent, model or trained model? I feel like if we have to start pinning, if you own the model, then you can pin it and you're maintaining the model, you're training that data set. But if you don't own it, that's where multiple
I,
people are. Like
I
an example is this AI, the open source, ChatGPT, what's behind ChatGPT. That's like a super shared model that's trained by the open, uh, those folks. So I just curious in how that might be,
I
there'll be risks.
imagine it would depend on the model and how it's used,
Yeah,
right? Like most obviously, if it's like an open source model that's running next to you, right? Then if you don't change the source code you're using, anything like that, then it's
yeah,
going to remain fixed, right?
yeah,
But then you're also like running a model in multiple places,
yeah,
which could maybe be expensive. But if it's something like ChatGPT, right, which I'm going to lean on Surtash's things here because I know nothing about their offering, but it sounds like they run a centralized service that you can reach out to via, a public
mhm,
REST API, and you can basically, I would imagine, give it instructions as to here's my request, here's how I would like you to evaluate that request, including like the specific flavor of model, right? And then whether that particular model is stable or not, well, that's a question of what contract does OpenAPI or sorry OpenAI have with its users.
and
Is
then
that
I'll show, yeah, that's pretty accurate, I think. So I'll show you, so just an example. So like to say like the new GPT-4 Turbo, if you just say this is not a pin model, right? So this will always be updated in the background. But currently it points to, this is like the latest tag, sort of like that. That's the analogy, right? But this is the pin version. So this is like a specific thing. This is like there's a knowledge cutoff for that
yeah,
pinned thing. And then same applies for like GPT-4, right? This is the latest tag, if you will, right? But you can have like 0613, or they're older ones, so there's a ton of them. Yeah, so that's when I say pinning. And then each of these might support different functionalities. For example, this one had like improved function calling. Some of them introduced new functionalities. So if you pin to an older, obviously, then you are not going to get the newer benefits of some of the newer improvements.
It sounds like if a company is able to maintain a model that's a policy model, right, that they're only going to use for policy AI output, then it only should be able to, give these responses and output related to Kubernetes policy that we want to apply against clusters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that applies to everything, right? Say like if you have a shared cluster, right, and then you upgrade your cluster, right, people's workloads are going to be broken because now you are not pinning anything, right? So it's kind of the same logic applies. If things can change under people, like say you have a VM, right, and then you upgrade it from Ubuntu 18.04 to 20.04, whatever, right, and then things may be broken because of that.
I would also say there's like two types of predictability to be concerned with here, right? There's one about given the same input, will I get the same output, right? And that's kind of what I'm hearing from you is like, okay, well, how do I make sure the model doesn't change out from underneath me so that it's predictable in that way? But the other thing is that the input is not constant, right? Like even if you're dealing with the same object, resource version changes over time or creation timestamp or whatever. And people create new K8s objects all the time. And so that's where this question of accuracy comes in of like, is it looking at the exact relevant data, like how is it making that decision? And explainability is not really strong in AI right now, right? Whereas if you have like Rego or Cell or whatever source code, you can literally point at the code and go, this is the field that it looked at, and this is how it compared, and you can know, right? But the cost there is, well, the source code isn't going to like intuit, right? If there's something you hadn't considered, it's just not going to happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It is kind of a black box. You can control it somewhat. So this is what I'm showing with the temperature, for example. That's basically like how it changes from like a more predictable to more like creative. So 0 would make it more predictive, for example. But it's not going to be like incredibly predictable, obviously. Yeah.
Just to clarify, you mean predictable for given identical input, you get identical output?
Yeah, so this basically kind of changes like the probability of stuff. So you get like a narrower range, I believe. So it's supposed to make the decision more predictable or like output more predictable.
But it doesn't necessarily change the sensitivity that the output has to the shape of the input. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it can still definitely change. Like even if I set to 0, some of the explanations that I get why it's denied changes from like one request to the other while the input is identical.
Okay. Yeah, for me, I think the most salient bit, like identical input constant is nice in terms of building confidence, but in terms of like actual like use in a practical situation, it's more about accuracy of results for a given unknown input, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. And then this is the other thing that I think you were asking about the system prompts. I'll drop it in the chat, but so you basically kind of define, say like this is like this is going to be tiny. Say you're a policy engine for community design, you output JSON. So that's basically how we can trigger the JSON mode. I don't know how to get this to word wrap. Okay, well, so input will be a policy definition and an admission request and the parameters that apply to the policy if applicable. Output JSON should only have a decision field with a Boolean value and the reason of the string value explaining the decision only if the decision is false. And I think I put only output. I don't know what is it. The Copilot is is taking over. Some only output like I think valid JSON probably something like that.
Copilot is like, I see you're doing AI.
How about me?
So
Yeah,
that's
and then
for that's for the response to the Kube API, right? That prompt was to tell it how once you
no,
get
that is to that's a system prompt to the LLM. So that's basically the sort of the initial prompt to like, hey, this is what you are, like the LLM.
Okay,
Like,
nice.
yeah, before it sees anything else, it sees that text that Surtesh just read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then what it gives the prompt of the template and the input values in like a JSON struct or something. Is that
Yeah, it outputs basically JSON with a decision, which is false or true.
no, for the input first.
Oh, I see. Yeah, the input is basically just the policy prompt, right? So only allowed privilege, whatever. And then the Kubernetes admission request that we get from the Kube API server. And then the parameters list if you have any. And then this is definitely can be optimized for more like predictable output and stuff. This is basically just I think I'd spend more time demoing this than actual implementation.
So, one thought is I'm personally of the view that you shouldn't like use this yet in any place where it really matters that everything be absolutely correct. Like both under enforcement and over enforcement should be fine in whatever environment. But one thought is if you had like the hard coded definition, right? Like the rego and the cell or whatever. And then you had like the AI definition, or you use the description as the AI definition. Maybe you could like very occasionally double execute the template, right? And then see if the AI decision agrees with the hard coded decision. And if there's divergence, use that as a signal that, hey, maybe your hard coded code has rotted, right? Like maybe they've added a new thing like ephemeral containers or something that your hard coded stuff didn't take that into account, but the AI has, right? And you could kind of use like thresholds of if this happens enough times, let it have a human look into it and make sure there's no bit rot or something.
Yeah, so like kind of like a built-in alerting sort of thing for like monitoring policies. Yeah, that's a cool idea.
Yeah. I don't know like what the marginal value is there, but like given that policies tend to be like written once and then not touched again, and the API can evolve out from underneath it.
Right.
Maybe.
I mean, this also comes back to whatever we were discussing earlier about like if something changes under you, then like you might get different outputs based on that.
Yeah, yeah. But use that to your advantage rather than be worried about it.
Mm-hmm.
So question on just like the kubectl AI, is that like a side project that you have? Or
oh yeah, that is my side project. Yes, let me drop
okay,
it.
cool. If you could drop.
Do you have a self-executing cluster? Like you just have a cluster, build me a web shop, and it starts.
So the kubectl AI came because because of Gatekeeper, right? So because we test a lot of like the I don't know services or pods or random sort of stuff for policies, right? And I keep this examples folder that has a lot of validated stuff in it, like pods, Nginx, like whatever. So right, I was like kind of tired of like keeping like all these sort of things. So like, why do I just like write a thing that would generate these objects instead of me creating a service thing, pod thing, deployment thing, stateful set thing. So that's basically how kubectl AI came into play.
Nice.
Very cool.
Someone's probably done this, but dropship.ai.
What is that?
Like, you know what dropshipping is? Where basically you run a inventory-less web store, is my understanding. And so
I see.
basically you just like forward orders.
like Temo and stuff, like sort of like a marketplace.
Yeah, it's like you are running a merch shop.
Yeah.
but you don't need to like hold stock.
Oh, I see.
You
Like just in time sort of. Yeah, I see.
On demand merchant.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's like a healthy idea for the web, but I would be surprised if people haven't done that.
With this PR and like it being experimental, and I totally understand it's for fun and just proof of concept type of stuff. If it's merged, but it will be usable for like us, the consumer, the user here, if we wanted to
Yeah, I mean,
mess with it.
if it's I mean, even today you can check out my branch and use it if you want.
Check it.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and obviously you will need to build the images, but yeah.
The whole building.
And then obviously even if it's merged, we wouldn't ask anybody to use this. This would be
Yeah,
like in addition to it, like you would have to enable the experimental flag. You would have to define like a policy. So this would be like a Rego cell, and then it would be the LLM engine. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. This all came because we had this hackathon a few years ago. We created these policies for WASM, and we already had the code. So basically, I merged that code, which is basically creating a new engine, and then I copy pasted from kubectl AI because I already have the API calls and stuff, and it basically just created a new gatekeeper driver, and that's about it. I mean, we already done the work for like integrating multiple drivers into gatekeeper, right? It could be LLM, it could be Rego, it could be Cell. I don't know. You could write your own policy language or whatever, so you can extend the frameworks with whatever engine you want.
very cool. Yeah. Are these hackathons reoccurring? Like, was it OPA specific or some other?
No, this was I think we had a Microsoft hackathon, and I think
Oh,
at the
okay.
time we asked Max and Davis, I think. Yeah, and then yeah, we worked on it.
Yeah, I tried to put Python in using WASM as an intermediary. I think Davis tried to do JavaScript. What were the other ones, Sertash?
So me and Rita, we worked on the WASM that's like for compiled languages, like say like compiling Go into WASM or like Rust into WASM, and then basically specifying it in the policy. So like you saw like the code as the prompt, right? So in that case, the code would be I think we added the SHA-56 of SHA-256 of the WASM. I mean, this was a hack, so it was like a very quick. And then I put it in the chat, by the way, the WASM policies. So you could basically write your policy as Go and then compile it into WASM and then deploy it. It's kind of fun. I have a lot of it was not easy. Yeah, Go didn't work so well with WASM at the time. We had to use TinyGo, but and then that one had a lot of I think issues or like limitations. Yeah, I don't know how it evolved since then.
Yeah, if I remember right, there was a few Achilles heels. Like one was definitely WASM size, right? Like because you had to like compile all of the libraries into each constraint template, basically, which is a
Right.
lot of reuse or a lot of double use or copy paste, I guess. Inter-process communication was also a problem, right? Like you think of WASM as insulating the host process from needing to know what language a child process is written in, or a client process, I guess they use this for the term. But in order to do any kind of like long running, I inject data, you give me a response kind of thing, you needed to allocate memory in the client process. And the means of doing that differ depending on the language. So in practice, it wasn't language neutral. You couldn't just say, feed me WASM. It was actually like, feed me Golang WASM or feed me Rust WASM or something like that. And I don't know if it's improved since then, but that was a limitation. For Python, the way they had Python working with WASM that I found was basically to take like CPython and compile that to WASM, right? And so it's still WASM is reading Python source code, making the Python bytecode, and interpreting that bytecode. And the one problem with that would be process isolation, right? Like, how do you keep a malicious constraint template from altering the standard libraries, right? Or because there's like shared storage there, unless you're running a completely different host for every template, which again would be expensive. Like how do you make it safe to just, or as safe as possible to consume arbitrary templates? Those are the ones I could remember. Do you remember any other like concerns or cool features or anything?
I remember, I think for Go, you couldn't use reflection at the time. I don't know if it changed again. That was a huge issue for like some of the APIs.
Oh, because like schemaless, you couldn't use
Yeah.
unstructured at that point, right?
Yeah, I don't really remember too much about it, but I remember like I think Kuborden was was basically maintaining a fork of the Kubernetes API because of that. Um, yeah, I remember taking a look at it and I was like, wow, okay, that's quite a lot of work. Yeah, that's I think one of the learnings that was like, okay, reflection is important.
Like half of anything to do with the Kubernetes scheme, I think, uses
Yeah,
reflection, or the schema object. Sorry, wait, is it schema? Eh.
yeah, I think both of them are. I've seen both. Yeah, I think it might have improved now. I think Go supports native, but native component of WASM now, but I don't know how much of it. It definitely improved. One of my sister teams work with WASM in a Go specifically too. Um, yeah.
Nice. Were they also able to do like, I don't know, sparse compilation or something where you could not need to build the entire Go standard library for every instance of a.
I don't know the deep on what is the status on that? Yeah, but I remember the build WASMs were like pretty big because it basically had the entire thing in there.
Yeah, it's like, was it megabytes?
Yeah, I think
Probably.
it was megabytes. Some of them megabytes. Some of them had better support than the other ones. Like I think Rust was like really great support, if I remember correctly. But like Go, not so much. Did we have any other agenda items for today?
Yeah, is there anything we didn't cover for you?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the names for the enforcement point for webhook and I VAP naming things.
Specifically, what, like before we get into the name bit, do we know what general enforcement points we have? Right, like there's audit, right? There's gator, there's admission. Is validating admission policy its own enforcement point, or is it just those three?
So that's also up to the discussion, right? Like what makes sense the best. In my opinion, it could be confusing for users to have two enforcement point for the same like webhook functionality. Uh, but at the same time, it gives specific control over which one to use since we are anyways using one of them.
Yeah, and I think this is why I was like eager to get buy-in on that doc around multi-target stuff, because it may also come down to like match criteria, right? Like, so if we view Kate's admission as like its own thing, then we can start thinking about what does it mean to match against resource, sub-resource, using request verb, requesting user, all of that. And I think there's overlap between VAP and an admission webhook for those kinds of things. If we try to treat them as different, I know there still might be some benefit because VAP has version conversion, right, as part of its resource matching. Right, so if you wanted to write something against the V1 beta 1 shape of a pod or whatever, you could rely on the API server to do that conversion for you. Which, they kind of treat the match criteria. VAP treats the match criteria as it does double duty, right? And if you're matching against resource and you have a specific resource version, it also use that as a hint that, hey, you should convert. So it may be the case that there's like significant behavioral differences still when you're dealing with admission as a generic concept versus VAP specific admission. And I'm not sure what dealing with those edge cases might look like if we take it one direction or the other, right? Like probably the problem if we go with VAP as the same thing as admission, right? So we just have admission.k8s.io or whatever. Is if we then want to supply version conversion, like maybe that could be part of the engine. Definitely, like but then the engine source code wouldn't be portable. But I also think there's probably multiple VAP engines we want. There's probably one where you could take VAP wholesale and just plug it in. So you could use things like authorizer, right? That you couldn't use anywhere but running natively on the API. And then the way it would look weird if validating admission policy is its own thing, right? So we want to reserve the space to like provide some enforcement point configuration. Oh, no, we've already left room for configuring enforcement points in your design doc, right? Like we said, here's some spaces where you can add extra configuration for an enforcement point, or at least for an enforcement action. I don't know if we did it.
So enforcement points is right now an array of map. So that map can be used to provide additional configurations for enforcement point in future. So that's the room for enforcement point, not for enforcement action.
So both enforcement point and for enforcement action, we have reserved spaces in the API where we could like provide both.
Yeah, I think we have in the I'm just looking at it, we have scoped and enforcement actions, and then there's action, and then there's enforcement point. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
You're asking specifically about the names, Jay?
No, so yeah, so on the PR itself, so one of the things that we want or we need to do is to define a specific name in the constraint itself so that the frameworks code can understand that this specific enforcement point needs VAP actions or not. So that's the root of the discussion. And then what Max is asking is that is there a room to provide additional context or information for enforcement point to make sense? Let's say for audit, if you want to provide any further context, or for VAP, if you want to provide any further context, can we put put that in the constraint template somewhere with this design or not?
I see. So this would be like disabling audit for VAP, for example.
No, because audit would be a enforcement point, right? So you would disable audit for a constraint, not for an engine. And VAP itself doesn't have audit. The way I view it, there's like a tree of predicated decisions, right? So JDIP at its most basic is like, what do I call these things, right? If someone says I want to use audit, what string do they use, right? If I want to use admission webhook, what string? If it's Gator, only what string, right? And there's some considerations there about how do we prevent like overlap if someone else wants to write their own enforcement point, right? Use the host name type model. But even before we get there, right, before we can like create some set of names that make sense, a question that we need to answer is, okay, but what enforcement points do we actually want to have, right? Like, do I need to distinguish between webhook admission versus VAP admission? Or can I just call it just admission, right? Because the names may look very different depending on like how we need to describe that to people. And before we know that answer, right, there's this question of why might we want to or not want to have VAP be separately identifiable as an enforcement point?
Yeah, VAP would be an enforcement point, right? If we wanted to.
Right. Well, but is it a different enforcement point than
admission.
The admission webhook?
Right. So we could either do like a general admission or specify to like VAP or GK or whatever.
Yeah.
So I have follow-up questions before we all dig deeper. Do you guys remember the change Rita made about after discussing that whether or not gatekeepers webhook can be used as a fallback to VAP? What was the result of that change? Are we going? I forgot. So
I think Max created a PR and that got merged.
It did, but it also turned out to be kind of superfluous. Like VAP will make a decision before it calls the webhooks. So assuming you get a rejection, it'll happen at the VAP level first. If you don't get a rejection, it will double run the policies. So my PR is kind of useful if you want to avoid double execution, save on CPU usage, latency.
What do you mean by if it goes through? Like if it's like a fail open, or do you mean if the decision is like allow?
Kind of both, right? Like, so it goes to validating admission policy first, right? And validating admission policy gets a chance to reject the request, whether that's because a policy is violated and so it's an explicit deny, or execution fails and the failure policy kicks in.
Because even VAP allows it, another webhook can deny it. Makes sense.
Right. And so VAP, if it denies it, that's the end. If it allows it, the webhooks get called.
Yeah.
If the webhooks get called, right, then the question is, well, Gatekeeper is going to get called, right? And Gatekeeper is also capable of executing VAP sourced constraint templates. So are you going to double execute, right, and have Gatekeeper run that same check?
Right.
Right now, the thought is like, yes, just because this is all new. And so why not have that fallback? And you avoid like race conditions around, oh, we think the cluster is like going to enforce it with VAP, but there's no way of knowing, right? Because you can't observe enforcement state with K8s VAP objects currently. But if users want to take a different tack because they want to avoid, extra resource spend, then they can, right? And try to do that disabling feature because they're like, I don't care about race conditions, I fail open anyway, or whatever. And we won't get double rejections, which was the main usability concern.
So in that features context, right, if we distinguish between VAP enforcement point and webhook enforcement point, that whole feature goes away, because now you like while using scoped enforcement action, user is required to I mean, I guess we have benefit of that feature when, like, let's say you can say that you want to use both the webhook, but in the constraint you only define one, so that for half of the policy or some of the policy only one webhook runs, while on the ones that you really want to make sure that this gets denied and there are no race conditions, you can run both webhooks. I guess that's the benefit of it.
Yeah, I think there's three options here, right? There is VAP and admission are completely separate things. I don't think that's viable because that's probably a backwards incompatible change. I mean, VAP is like a demo or not demo. It's an alpha, right? So we still have room to make breaking changes there. But once it gets in beta, that option is out, right? We won't be able to separate. Another option could be to just have a single webhook, right? Or sorry, a single enforcement point name called like K8s admission. And then if we decide we want to split it out later, that we start getting into configuring of the enforcement point, right? And that honestly, that kind of looks like what we have now. We're just moving the annotation or the label, which is how we're currently doing things, into the enforcement point config. Another option would be to have three enforcement points, right? One that's just generic admission, one that's like admission webhook, and one that's VAP. And so generic admission would look like basically that second suggestion I had. But then if you really wanted to be super specific, I'm kind of leaning toward just generic admission.
Yeah,
As we're
it would,
talking this.
I think it would be better to enhance the enforcement point spec to further specify if specific webhook user wants to use specific webhook rather than having two different enforcement point.
Yeah.
For different webhook.
That's
also.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. The last bit.
That's also right possible, because there is a room for improvement or enhancement on enforcement point API anyways.
Yeah, the edge case there then would be, let's pretend now that I want some new engine, let's call it RAWVAP, where Gatekeeper is like, I cannot evaluate this. This is going to be useless for audit. This is going to be useless for Gator. But what I will do is I will create the VAP resources for you and manage them. And that would be necessary if you wanted to use features that only VAP as embedded by the API server can provide, right? Version conversion, authorizer, I'm not sure whatever else, but those two are pretty major ones. At that point, that engine only makes sense with VAP. So how would we message that to users? Maybe it's moot, right? Like, is it really that different to say you must use the VAP enforcement point versus saying, hey, your admission enforcement point needs to have this specific config associated with it? Do you get the edge case I'm pointing out, and sort of what it might look like, how it might look different to the users with the two different options?
Yeah.
And also how it might, I mean, that one is just kind of weird because it so tightly couples engine to enforcement points.
Yeah, like constraints are independent of engine anyways, right?
To an extent. You could imagine let's say in the future we support SQL as a language because we want to run audit processes that operate over large data sets, right? Um, Necessarily an SQL type thing is not going to be a good fit for admission, right? Because it, the latency of running these long running requests, right? It's kind of like that old how do you use SQL in a
So you will have to provide SQL configurations alongside audit enforcement point to use that specific thing.
Well, yeah, what I would imagine is one, there's going to be certain constraints that only make sense to have SQL, right? Because those constraints require large data sets. And so you're going to use SQL. You're not going to use Rego. You're not going to use any of these other things. And two, there's going to be certain enforcement points that can interpret SQL and certain enforcement points that can't. And so, because it just doesn't make sense. And so what you're going to wind up with effectively is some constraints can only be enforced in certain enforcement points based off of their source code. Right now, that's already going to be true with match criteria, right? Once we start matching off of request verb, but that is based off a property of the constraint, whereas this will be a property of the constraint template, right? That's your template's SQL, not you're using a match criteria. So is that easier to check and explain if you could draw like a straight line saying like, okay, engine only associates with certain enforcement point names versus engine associates with certain enforcement point names if those enforcement points have specific configurations?
Yeah, names, like in that case, having specific names makes it easier for in my opinion, for users and also us, because the need for validating specific thing goes away, and like user can have a clear idea about what to provide with in future in case with specific enforcement point name, rather than getting to know about I mean, if higher level specification, I think makes more sense, but that comes with a cost of abstraction as well.
Which, honestly, what that sounds like to me is if we go with that option 2 I talked about, where you have just admission, generic K8s admission, and then you can have configuration beneath that if you so choose. If we go that route, then we're just running the risk of eventually we'll get into option 3, where we have generic K8s admission, but we also have VAP, right? And then if you're using this like raw VAP engine or whatever, you need to use the VAP enforcement point because that's otherwise you like can use the generic one, but it needs to be configured in a certain way. That's a complicated check to write. It's a complicated check to communicate. So I guess the question is, are we okay with the idea that there be like potentially overlapping enforcement points? I'm not particularly bothered by it.
Yeah, I think that also has better readability when somebody is just reading the constraint. They can specifically understand what this constraint access is in terms of gatekeepers endpoint.
All right, so are we good then with for right now generic admission, audit, and Gator are the taxonomy that we need to name?
Well, I think I misunderstood. I was going the other way, having specific names for VAP and gatekeeper webhook as well. Because of what
Oh.
you said, right? Like if we eventually go down the path and take the risk, or somewhere around in the future, if we have the need of uh, having specific configuration for VAP, having specific configuration of GK8 webhook, for example, in under a common name, then why not separate them right now?
Should we start small and then add over time?
Like the number, well, that's the question, right? So if JDIP, if we want to address JDIP's concern, then we need to make that change before VAP goes into beta, because that will be a breaking change, right? Because basically VAP, if we want to, we're changing how you can allocate VAP to either be evaluated by Kubernetes or by Gatekeeper.
I mean, what happens if we don't even add admissions as an enforcement point?
Then we've underspecified, right? Like we need to have some kind of enforcement point for admission style, right? Like whether it's VAP and webhook, or whether it's just admission, or whether it's admission plus VAP plus webhook, right? One of those three outcomes needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
In order to change, to specify admission gets this enforcement action.
But this is for scope DA, right? So somebody like goes in and says like, hey, I want this sort of thing. So like if we didn't support admission, then that like it would be nothing basically, right?
Sorry, I do need to leave soon. If we support, sorry, scoped enforcement, right? But we need admission for scoped enforcement actions, because that's how you would say, for instance, only evaluate
Right.
this constraint for admission.
Hmm.
But are we breaking backward compatibility if this is under scoped enforcement action anyways? Like right now, there are annotation gems, and if somebody doesn't use this scoped enforcement action, then VAP is the by default choice there, right? So this only comes around when somebody is actively willing to use this functionality and go through
Right,
the
and
trouble.
That's what I'm saying. This is an opt-in behavior.
Yeah, that I think that implies that we're already in this situation where we have admission as a generic enforcement point.
Yeah, because now based on whether you use annotation or not, enforcement, like the respective webhook gets involved.
Yeah. I mean,
but then I would argue that the specific annotation is behaving as an enforcement point of invoking different webhooks, right? Like if you use VAP, then it goes to VAP. If you don't use VAP, then it goes to a webhook gatekeeper. So there is already one distinction of which enforcement point you are using.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we already have that with the annotation.
You have the ability to do that with the annotation, but you are not required to do that with the annotation.
But otherwise, it's just going to default to whatever gatekeeper's flag is.
So, sorry, I do need to drop. We can maybe
continue in Slack. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.